All right, so tonight's talk is with Zack Zlotnik. He is an engineer at IBM, a longtime friend of mine. Zack is probably one of the people that I've known the longest in Pittsburgh. I think we go back to I can't remember if it was like early 2002 or I think it was early 2003 was when Zack and I met. So we've known each other for a long time, and we've had lots of talks about hiring and interviews over the time. And I'm really excited to host him once again tonight. Zack has previously spoken for abstractions and for hard facts, as well as some other code and supply talks. So please welcome Zack Zlotnik to our virtual stage.
Thank you, Colin. So as Colin mentioned, my name is Zack Zlotnik, and this evening I'm presenting Interview Prep Considered Harmful. So this is meant to be a sibling talk of another presentation I once gave entitled The Mental Impact of Tech Interviews. While it's certainly not required viewing, it will help reinforce some of the points that this talk will make. In fact, some of the points that are made in this talk will be some of the same ones there. So if you've seen the one, some of this stuff may sound familiar to you. What I aim to cover this evening is how and why people practice for interviews, why they don't exactly measure what we think they measure, and ways we can kind of course correct for this. So let's get started. The first question that I could probably hear someone asking is, what's wrong with preparing for an interview? Short answer is there's nothing. Data has shown that they favor people who can devote significant time to study, practice, preparation, etc. Not only that, practicing for them increases the likelihood that you would get an offer. It just seems kind of, simple to say that. So how does one typically prepare for these? There's a bunch of resources out there, like books. Cracking the Coding Interview is probably the most popular one. It's been around for quite a while. I think it's in its 6th or 7th edition now. There's online communities where you can go and solve toy problems in a web browser and everything. I'll point out that HackerRank, Code Wars, and Top Coder in particular offer pre-screening services to tech companies, and that's something that we'll talk about later on in the presentation. There's boot camps, and this is not meant to be an indictment about boot camps, as they teach very valuable skills and practices. But I would be remiss if I didn't at least point out that most coding boot camps offer courses on how to pass whiteboard interviews. There's online classes too, through Coursera, Udemy, and there's also ways that people can do mock interviews as a service, and in some cases they can turn into real interviews. The two most well-known ones that I'm aware of are Interviewing.io and Interview Cake. Interviewing.io is interesting because one of the things they do is they collect data, they perform some analysis, and we'll be discussing some of this later on. And so Interviewing.io in particular also offers a pre-screen as a service type of arrangement. There's even college courses that one can take to prepare for whiteboard interviews. For example, Stanford University offers a course specifically for this, and why? And so it kind of prompts the question of, why do you need a course specifically just to pass a whiteboard interview? Some companies also provide study materials to potential candidates. In fact, here's a screenshot of a Facebook interview prep guide that I once received around circa 2018. I recognize that some of you may not be able to read this, but the link to my presentation will be shared at the end, and there will be a link in there with all of this included. Coaching. There are a lot of current and former engineers from Facebook, Amazon, and Google that make themselves available oftentimes for a fee to do practice interviewing with. In fact, one enterprising Airbnb host offered the experience of a mock Amazon job interview. And so one of the questions that this kind of brings to my mind is, what does this say about accuracy and efficacy of whiteboard interviews? And this kind of brings up some of the points that I have that I've certainly made previously about the fact that they're not objective or they're accurate, and they're not certainly not unbiased. I mean, two different interviewers can have drastically different expectations for how far someone should be able to answer a given question. They're not reflective of what we do every day. My average day involves code reviews, tracking down bugs, writing docs, and sometimes doing exploratory work with new APIs and other platforms and things like that. Interviewing IO has pretty much determined that outcomes are arbitrary and random at best. And they purposely have a high false negative rate, the thinking that it's better to turn someone good away than to hire someone bad. But like anything, interviewing itself is a skill, one which has to be practiced or it will atrophy. And so one of the questions that I've asked myself, and I've certainly seen others ask, is, well, how much practice is needed to pass a whiteboard interview? The short answer, a lot. An interesting statistic that I found was that some job seekers will spend 100+ hours just preparing for an interview. And assuming that they spend 8 hours a day doing that, and that alone, that's 12 and a half days or almost 2 weeks. I've heard, in this study here that we'll talk about later, 40+ mock interview sessions seem to be required for someone to overcome performance anxiety for interviews. And assuming that's 1 hour per session, that's an entire work week. Now, of course, with anything like this, there are going to be outliers. This person supposedly spent 8 months studying full-time for a Google interview. So what prevents someone from preparing for these? The first one that I can think of is working a full-time job. If you're already employed, this coupled with the rest of your life and your responsibilities outside of work can sometimes prevent you from spending the time and energy necessary to, in fact, practice for interviews. Sometimes one may work multiple jobs, especially if someone is kind of trying to get to the point where they're going to make their big break into tech. Being in school, academic reasons, in addition to people that may work a part-time job to put themselves through school. They may find both time and energy to be in short supply. People who may have to care for others. Some people may have children, elderly relatives, or in my case, 2 of these. They're cute, but they're a lot of work. There's also the self-care element, and we all need to make time for self-care. And self-care takes many forms. These just happen to be a few of my favorites. And if you like these things, feel free to DM me on Slack. We can talk about those. There's working on open source. Now, here's the thing. I acknowledge I'm being slightly facetious with this one, but it does raise a good question. If Linus had to study and prepare for interviews so he could get a full-time job, would Linux exist? How many other potential game-changing, paradigm-shifting, insert buzzword here, open source projects would not be created because somebody needs to get a job to put a roof over their head and food in their belly because they have to prepare for interviews to get said job, so they don't have the time necessarily to sit down and tinker on it. The bottom line is, not everyone can devote 2 or more weeks to prepare for interviews. And this is assuming that one can fully devote themselves solely to this practice. And unfortunately, most can't. So why does one need to do this? I mean, why does one need to practice this? So to answer that question, actually, Facebook answered that very well in their study guide. They say that a coding interview is an unnatural event, even if you are used to coding regularly for your job. They go on to say the problems are different, the environment is different, and you're under time pressure. So my takeaway from this is they know it's ridiculous, but they do it anyway. So why are these so difficult? Why? I mean, it seems like a simple thing. Write something. Write some code on a whiteboard, but they're difficult for many reasons. One of which is just no other reason than the bar. We want to keep our hiring bar high. In some cases, I feel like they've gotten more difficult because more preparation resources are available and more people are pursuing tech careers that have had a non-traditional education, from boot camps to people being self-taught. And the interviews themselves are often adversarial. There's a power dynamic in play where the interviewer's sole goal is to administer an exercise. And many people refer to these as challenges, which, when you think about it, that adds a level of hostility to what's already kind of a stressful process. And lastly, the bulk of the time allocated to these only leaves a token amount left for questions at the very end. Your average on-site interview at a large tech company can consist of 4 or more interviews over the course of 4 to 6 hours. And that's quite, that's a marathon. That's quite a marathon when you think about it. According to NASA, they performed a study several years ago that showed that subjects were shown to significantly slow their evaluation of math problems when they were placed under stress. And we'll talk about this a little more. Does stress impact technical interview performance? The short answer is yes, it does, but not for the reasons that you think. There is a study from North Carolina State University that was published in June entitled Does Stress Impact Technical Interview Performance? That answers this question and many other questions, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that. So they actually came up with some pretty interesting conclusions. One of their conclusions was that whiteboard interviews bear a resemblance to what's called the Trier Social Stress Test, and we'll talk about that a little more. Essentially, what it is it is known as the gold standard procedure for reliably inducing stress in someone. And the way that it works, at least the kind of highlights, is a study participant is given 5 minutes to prepare for a presentation, which, by the way, is usually presented as part of a job interview. And so they're given pen, paper, etc., in order to prepare for this. When after 5 minutes passes, the materials are taken away and they are asked to begin their presentation. And the presentation is supposed to last 5 minutes. And throughout the presentation, the judges or audience, if you will, are to make no comments, kind of keep very neutral facial expressions, so on and so forth. If the participant has finished within the 5-minute window, the audience will ask them to continue. And this goes on until the 5 minutes are completely exhausted. And then immediately after this, they are asked to complete a mental arithmetic component, which by the way, also takes 5 minutes. And in the example that I found, they were asked to count backwards from 1022 in steps of 13. And if they make a mistake, they have to start all over again from the beginning. And this continues until they've either reached 0 or the 5 minutes has run out. So it's that, it sounds like something that could be very stressful, and it does sound a lot like a lot of interviews I've been through. And so one of the other things that they've kind of uncovered is that it's actually a form of stress inoculation training. And so one of the other conclusions that they came with this is that even though this practice does help someone pass these interviews, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's the most effective skill assessment tool out there. And another interesting thing that they came up with, or not came up with, but identified, was that they don't measure technical ability. Instead, they measure how well someone handles anxiety. And so I got my slides kind of jumbled. Sorry about that. What stress inoculation training is it prepares someone for the effects of stressful situations by giving them the skills to effectively handle it well in advance, like kind of saying, you're going to get in this position, you're going to be stressed, you have to do this thing. And so what's interesting about this is it's sometimes used as a therapeutic tool for post-traumatic stress disorder. And when you reflecting on this, it kind of makes sense when you consider how you might feel after a really bad interview that you just weren't prepared for at all. And so these things don't take into account external stressors, such as the stress someone might feel due to a layoff because of COVID-19, someone who's currently in a toxic work situation, or the kind of background noise and background stressors that go on in people's lives. So this kind of brings up an important question, which is high performance under duress a requirement for software professionals? My opinion is no, it's not. In fact, to me, it doesn't sound like a job I would even want to do. And so there are certainly cases where software disasters have occurred, and I would be remiss if I didn't at least point these out, such as the Therac 25 or the Ariane 5 rocket disaster, or what's going on now with the 737. And so the short answer is these disasters were caused by faulty processes such as no code reviews, no testing, and other organizational issues. They weren't caused because someone couldn't implement a linked list on a whiteboard. So what professions benefit from this type of practice, and from frequently practicing the skills as well as going through kind of stress inoculation? So the first one that springs to my mind is cave diving. And this one's kind of near and dear to me because I am certified to do this. And while you're down there, you have to kind of you have to navigate. You have to make sure your air consumption is okay, make sure your depth is okay, make sure of your decompression obligations. Not only that, but the training often involves having to exit a cave in complete darkness while sharing air with just a guideline to get you back to the surface. Pilots are another great example of this. This picture is of the flight deck of the Concorde, an aircraft which can hurtle through the air at over 2 times the speed of sound. So imagine if they have an engine failure or an instrument failure or something like that. They're frequently drilled in simulators for how to respond to these things. Surgeons, if you're performing open heart surgery or any other form of surgery for that matter, there's the margin of error is very high. And people who operate nuclear reactors, there's a lot of intricate systems there that someone has to understand, and a lot of ways that they can go wrong, and they have to kind of understand how to mitigate those things. So what do all of these jobs have in common with one another? The first is they all have a very high cognitive load. There's a lot of things to think about as these professionals do their various jobs. They all have a low margin for error. They all have stressful and potentially hazardous work environments. Surgeons and cave diving in particular certainly have that. They often have specialized training and education requirements, like having to go to school for a certain number of years, having to go through a very rigorous exam, and so on and so forth. And some have re-education requirements that you have to level up, or you have to retake training every so often. In these fields, mistakes can cost lives, not just dollars. They often have a regulatory agency or authority, often with specific legal requirements and authority. So, for example, the FAA governs anything to do with aircraft, piloting them, moving them, air traffic control, etc. And so for these professions, frequent practice in stress inoculation makes a lot of sense. And I should also point out that interview processes for these jobs don't usually involve completing pet exercises, especially to my understanding, pilots. There's a YouTuber by the name of Captain Joe who does a very good discussion on what they do. So where's the harm in all of this? If someone wants to spend 100 hours or more practicing for interviews, why stop them? So one of the things that I've kind of observed over the years is that we both intentionally and unintentionally make interviews more stressful through a variety of ways. For example, interview questions are often not known in advance, and in fact, some companies, if an interview question gets disclosed, it gets put on a banned question list so that it can't be asked again. We justify this by saying, I want to see how you think on your feet. I want to see how you solve problems. I want to see you struggle with an unfamiliar problem. My next slide is going to put all of this stuff into it. It's going to give an interesting new context to this, and that is that people who use brain teasers are more likely to be socially inept, callous, narcissistic, and even sadistic in their interviews. So why, given all of this stuff, why would anyone want to keep whiteboard interviews this way? Why are we still doing it this way? So common answers to this that I've seen and heard are, this is how we've always done it. I had to do it, so you do too. And quite frankly, I think those answers are just completely without any kind of merit. The one answer I keep seeing, though, is gatekeeping, and this is certainly a very valid answer to this, but I actually have a far simpler answer after doing some analysis and preparation for this talk. It's because it's profitable. So cracking the coding interview sells for about $27 on Amazon. But did you know that the author also runs a consulting service that helps companies adopt and implement the style of interview processes that the book claims to help crack? Many of the online communities also offer tech assessments as a service. In fact, some of them charge for both enhanced access to their community and also for the technical assessment product itself. For example, HackerRank charges anywhere from $249 to upwards a month for their platform. LeetCode, which is more of a preparation service, or I'm sorry, a practice service, offers you a yearly subscription for $159 per year. Interview Cake offers a money-back guarantee, and their fully fledged full course with coaching costs a Tony $4,900. Interview Camp charges $250 for an online boot camp specifically for technical interviews. Algo Expert charges $129 for their fully fledged content. So, and there's countless others that do this. In fact, there are many companies out there that claim that they're fixing the problem of technical interviews. But if you look at what they're doing, they're just rehashing the same stuff over and over again. They usually rely on some form of a timed coding assessment. Some have an online community that train you how to code. Some people even claim to be former Facebook, Amazon, or Google engineers that may do this either as kind of a side gig, or maybe this is their main gig. So how do we fix this? How do we fix this whole situation? It seems like just a whirlwind for just a whole lot of bad behavior, if you will. So many of the points that I'm about to mention, I've mentioned before, but they still bear repeating. So the first one is admitting that it's broken. Don't acknowledge that it's bad, but that's just the way that it is. And people take pride in their processes being rigorous, thorough, selective, a grind, grueling, etc. And and I don't see, and I don't understand why that's actually a good thing. So if your interview process has a study guide, it doesn't necessarily mean that your interviews are measuring what you think you're measuring. Instead, they're measuring how much time and energy has to devote to studying and preparing and stress inoculating themselves for your interview. Why does it really need to be that hard to get a job? Does the bar really need to be that high? One question that I find that people really do need to ask themselves sometimes is, could you pass the interview for your current job right now, like after you've been there for a year or two? Like, would you be able to do that? One of the things that I feel needs to happen is we need to reduce stress on people as much as possible. And if that means using alternative screening methods, like not doing live coding interviews or things of that nature, then so be it. Another way is be specific about what the interview is going to cover. If you're just going to put down what is basically a CS 101 course syllabus of things that people should prepare, should be knowledgeable on, like arrays, maps, so on and so forth. Instead, you should be very specific about what it will cover. In fact, better yet, why not tell them what the question is in advance? I mean, what's the worst that's going to happen? Someone is going to know what the question is. They're going to understand it. They're going to be able to think about a solution when they're not completely stressed out. And when they go in for the interview, they'll be able to explain that solution, how it came to them, why they think it's the best particular solution, as well as any trade-offs that come along with it. Now, I need to point out, this is not the same thing as giving someone a take-home assignment or even a study guide. Instead, what the message here is please be prepared to answer the following questions. What is a hash map? What is an array? Things like that. Granted, that's kind of ultra simplistic, but maybe what would be the best way to do this? Offer multiple ways to evaluate skills. Not everyone is good at live coding. Some people may prefer a take-home, and I'm not suggesting that you should use take-homes. And many would just rather not code in an interview at all. And also, like I said, stop demanding that people write code while you look over their shoulder. Regardless of the medium, whether it's on a whiteboard, shared editor, whatever, you're not measuring someone's coding ability. You're measuring their ability to respond to stress, and not everyone is stress inoculated for this particular scenario. Remember, you're trying to find future coworkers, just the same as the candidates that you are interviewing. So with that in mind, would you tolerate a coworker who purposely makes situations way more stressful than necessary? I mean, I certainly know that I wouldn't. And why would you tolerate this in an interview? I mean, I know one of the answers that most people might say is I need a job so I can afford a place to live and to feed myself. But we all need a job, we all need a place to live, and we all need to feed ourselves. So why is this something that we would tolerate? And the point of this is to have a conversation. You're not interrogating somebody, you're not deposing somebody, you're not examining somebody. You're not ambushing somebody. There's no pride in a process that's known to cause unnecessary stress and anxiety at all. By keeping the status quo, which requires job seekers to spend, 100+ hours to prepare, this is exactly what's happening. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Thank you very much, Zach. That was very excellent. And it's great to have these kinds of discussions about the processes that affect all of us at some point in our career. We would love to have more content like this out there. So those of you who are interested in talking about interviewing, about hiring, about recruiting, please do submit to Speak Code and Supply. This is the kind of content that we absolutely love to host. And those of you who are on the stream, please, I guess, clap to yourselves for Zach and his outstanding presentation. I'll make some noise. All right. That's about it for our stream. Do stay on if you want to be involved in some brief QA that we're going to do off stream. I'm going to throw up this little screen real quick, just so we have an actual outro for our video. Once again, thank you very much, Zach.